Sometimes the heaviest burden a man carries isn't what's in his hands, it's what's in his heart. For 30 years, Thomas Avery has been running from ghosts that won't let him rest. Now he's tracking a wounded bear through Apache territory when he finds a young girl protecting a frightened cub. She looks up at this weathered hunter with his rifle raised and speaks 4 simple words that change everything. He's just a child too. Those words hit Thomas harder than any bullet ever could. Here's a man who's spent decades believing that strength means never showing mercy. But this brave girl shows him something he'd forgotten. That real courage sometimes means choosing to protect instead of destroy. What happens when a lifetime of violence meets pure compassion? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona territory stretched endlessly under a copper sun, its red earth baked hard as iron and scarred by decades of conflict. In the autumn of 1885, this was still a land where a man's word was his bond and his rifle was his law. The desert. Winds carried stories of gold strikes and Indian wars, of settlers pushing west and warriors pushing back, of blood spilled on both sides until the very stones seemed stained with it. Thomas Avery had been riding these harsh lands for more years than he cared to count. At 53, his face bore the weathered lines of a man who'd seen too much and carried too many burdens. His gray beard was streaked with white, and his pale blue eyes held depths that spoke of loss and regret. The Winchester rifle resting across his saddle was as much a part of him as his own hands worn smooth from decades of use. Its stock marked with 27 small notches. Each notch told a story. Each one had a name dot in his saddlebags. Wrapped in oiled leather lay a journal bound in cracked hide. Its pages were filled with careful sketches and methodical notes, a record of every life he'd taken in service to the law, to settlers, to anyone willing to pay his price. The faces stared back from yellowed paper with haunting clarity. Rustlers, claim jumpers, murderers, and yes, even some who'd done nothing more than be in the wrong place when fear and prejudice held sway. Thomas had stopped looking at those pages years ago, but he kept the journal still, carrying his sins like stones in his chest. The morning had started like any other coffee, black as tar, jerky tough as leather, and the endless horizon calling him forward. He'd been tracking the wounded grizzly for 3 days now, following a blood trail that led deeper into Apache country with each mile. The bear had mauled 2 prospectors near Tucson before Thomas was hired to finish what they'd started. It should have been simple work, track, find, kill, collect payment. The same dance he'd performed countless times before, but something felt different this time. Maybe it was the way the morning light seemed softer here in the sacred mountains, or how the desert flowers bloomed despite the harsh conditions. Maybe it was the strange dreams that had been haunting him, visions of his late wife Sarah laughing in their kitchen, their boy Daniel running through fields that didn't exist anymore. Dreams that left him waking with tears on his cheeks and an ache in his chest that no amount of whiskey could numb. The trail led up into the Chiricahua Mountains, where ancient saguaro cacti stood like sentinels, and the rocks themselves seemed to whisper of older times. This was sacred ground to the Apache, land where their ancestors had walked and died and been buried, according to traditions that stretched back to the beginning of memory. Thomas knew he was trespassing here, but the grizzly's blood trail didn't respect boundaries any more than the men who'd paid him to cross them. His horse, a steady roan Mari named Patience, picked her way carefully up the rocky slope. She'd been his companion for 8 years now, the longest relationship he'd maintained since Sarah and Daniel died. Patience had earned her name through countless dangers, never spoking at gunfire, never throwing him when bullets flew. She was getting old now, gray showing around her muzzle, but her step remained sure and her heart brave. The blood trail grew fresher as the day wore on. Dark spots on pale stone, smears on juniper bark, and the occasional tuft of brown fur caught on. Thorny Ocotillo told the story of a creature in pain, growing weaker with each mile. Thomas felt an unexpected stab of sympathy for the beast. Whatever had happened near Tucson, whatever violence had erupted between man and animal, the grizzly was just following its nature. It wasn't evil, just dangerous, and in this territory, dangerous things got killed before they could hurt anyone else. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Thomas noticed something that made him rein in patience and study the ground more carefully. Mixed with the bear's tracks were smaller prints, human feet, bare and light, moving parallel to the blood trail. Someone was following the wounded animal, staying close but careful, matching its pace for what looked like miles. Thomas dismounted and knelt by the clearest set of prints. Small feet, narrow and delicate, with no sign of boots or moccasins. The stride was shorter than a grown man's, but steady and purposeful. Whoever was making these tracks knew the country well and moved with confidence that spoke of long experience in these mountains. The implications troubled him. Apache warriors wore moccasins and left different tracks entirely. These were the feet of someone young, someone who belonged to this land but wasn't yet fully grown. The thought of a child, Apache or otherwise, tracking a wounded grizzly sent cold worry through Thomas's chest. Whatever else he'd become over the years, whatever violence he'd done and blood he'd spilled, he'd never raised a hand against an innocent. Some lines, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. The tracks continued up the mountain, weaving between massive boulders and following game trails that seemed to disappear and reappear like smoke. Thomas had to admit the tracker was skilled staying downwind of the bear, moving quietly over ground that would echo with the slightest misstep, reading sign that would escape most grown men. It reminded him of his own youth, when his father had taught him to hunt in the forests of Kentucky, before the war, before Sarah, before the long parade of death that had brought him to this desert wasteland. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Thomas finally heard what he'd been tracking. A low, pained groan echoed from somewhere ahead, the sound of a large animal in distress. He dismounted again and checked his rifle, working the lever to chamber around, then thought better of it and eased the hammer down. Better to see the situation before making noise that might alert whatever or whoever else was nearby. He left patience ground-tied and moved forward on foot, using every skill he'd learned in 30 years of hunting dangerous men and beasts. The sound came again, closer now, accompanied by something that made his blood run cold. A soft, musical voice speaking words he couldn't understand but recognized as Apache. Someone was talking to the wounded grizzly, and from the gentle tone, they were trying to comfort it. Thomas crept between two massive boulders and finally saw what lay ahead. In a small clearing surrounded by mountain mahogany and manzanita bushes, the grizzly lay on its side, breathing heavily. Dark blood matted the fur on its shoulder and flank, and one massive paw hung at an unnatural angle. The bear's eyes were clouded with pain and approaching death, but it made no aggressive moves, just lay there, accepting whatever fate awaited. Kneeling beside the giant creature, her small hands gentle on its massive head, was a young Apache girl who couldn't have been more than 15 years old. Her long black hair was braided with strips of colored cloth, and she wore a simple dress of tanned hide decorated with intricate beadwork. As Thomas watched in amazement, she continued speaking to the dying bear in her own language, her voice soft and soothing as a mother's lullaby. But that wasn't what stopped Thomas cold and made his finger freeze on his rifle's trigger. Curled against the grizzly's belly, protected by one massive foreleg, was a small bear cub. The little creature couldn't have been more than a few months old, its fur still dark brown rather than the grizzled silver of its mother. The cub was alive, but clearly frightened, pressing close to the dying bear for warmth and comfort. And, Summoned the girl, obviously had torn strips from her own dress to bandage what looked like claw marks on the cub's side. The scene before him challenged everything Thomas thought he knew about the world. Here was a young Apache girl, member of a tribe his people had fought and feared for generations, risking her life to comfort a dying bear and care for its orphaned young. She showed no fear of the massive predator, no hesitation about approaching a creature that could kill her with a single swipe of its paw. Instead, she offered the same gentle compassion any mother might show to a suffering child. Thomas had raised his rifle without thinking, the motion as automatic as breathing after so many years. The girl hadn't noticed him yet, focused entirely on the animals before her. From his position, he had a clear shot at both the wounded grizzly and the cub. He could end this here and now put the mother out of her misery, kill the cub before it grew large enough to threaten anyone, collect his payment, and ride away. Just another job completed, another problem solved with violence. But something held him back. Maybe it was the girl's obvious courage and compassion. Maybe it was the way the dying bear seemed to trust her, allowing her touch when it should have, mauled her out of pain and fear. Maybe it was just the memory of his own boy Daniel, who'd loved every stray cat and injured bird he'd ever found, who'd cried when they had to put down a horse with a broken leg. The girl must have sensed his presence, because she slowly turned her head and looked directly at him. Her dark eyes were large and intelligent, holding depths of wisdom that seemed far older than her years. She showed no fear at the sight of the armed white man, no surprise at being discovered in this remote place. Instead, she simply looked at him with a steadiness that made him feel like she could see straight through to his soul. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Thomas kept his rifle raised, but didn't take aim. The girl kept her hands on the dying bear, but didn't flee. Between them lay a chasm of culture and history, of war and bloodshed and mutual mistrust that stretched back generations. But in that clearing with the wounded animals between them, something else flickered to life, a recognition that transcended race and revenge. A moment of shared humanity that neither had expected to find. The grizzly chose that moment to draw her last breath, a long sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire wilderness. The cub whimpered and pressed closer to his mother's still form, confused and frightened by her sudden stillness. The girl's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away from Thomas's face. She was protecting him, the girl said, speaking English with only a slight accent. The men with the loud guns, they tried to take her baby. She fought to save him. Thomas felt something crack inside his chest, some long-frozen part of his heart beginning to thaw. The story suddenly made sense, prospectors. Finding a bear cub, trying to capture it for profit or entertainment, the mother grizzly attacking to defend her young. The same story that played out between humans every day. The same drive to protect that had sent him to war. That had made him hold his dying son while fever took him inch by inch. "Step away from the cub," Thomas said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "I've got a job to finish here." The girl didn't move. Instead, she placed both hands protectively over the small bear, shielding it with her own body. "He's just a child too," she said quietly. "Like you were once, like I'm now. What did he do to deserve death for his mother's love?" Those words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He'd been called many things over the years: killer, gun for hire, the white man's death, but no one had ever asked him to see himself in his victims. No one had ever made him remember that he'd once been a child too, innocent and trusting, before the world taught him that survival meant being harder and faster, and more ruthless than anyone else. His rifle barrel wavered slightly. The girl noticed, and pressed her advantage, not with aggression, but with the same gentle persistence she'd shown the dying bear. "My grandmother used to say that we're all children of the same sky," she continued. "That the anger between our peoples is like a storm. It rages for a time, but it always passes. The question is what grows after the rain stops falling." Thomas found himself thinking of Sarah, of the way she'd looked at him the day Daniel was born, like he was capable of great good instead of great harm. He thought of his son's trusting smile, the way the boy has never seen him as a killer, but only as a father coming home. The girl was right. The cub was just a child, orphaned and afraid, no different from any other creature that had lost its protection in a harsh world. Thomas had the power to end that small life with a squeeze of his finger, but for the first time in years, he found himself asking not whether he could, but whether he should. The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Thomas could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the familiar weight of the Winchester in his hands, could smell the copper scent of blood and the sweet mountain air. Everything in his experience told him to pull the trigger, complete the job, and ride away. But something had shifted in that moment when the girl looked at him with those ancient eyes, something fundamental that he couldn't quite name. The bear cub whimpered again, a small sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet clearing. It was trying to nurse from its dead mother, confusion evident in its clumsy movements. The girl, he still didn't know her name, reached into a small leather pouch at her waist and pulled out what looked like strips of dried meat. She offered them to the cub with infinite patience, speaking softly in Apache until the little creature began to eat from her hand. "His name is Shash," she said without looking up from the cub. "It means bear in my language. My grandmother named him that when we first found them 3 days ago." "You've been following them?" Thomas asked, his rifle still raised but no longer aimed directly at them. "Following, yes, but also protecting." She gestured to the makeshift bandage around the cub's middle, strips of soft leather and cloth that had clearly been torn from her own dress. "The men who shot his mother, they wounded him too. Not badly, but enough to slow him down, make him vulnerable." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. Shooting a mother bear was one thing. Dangerous animals had to be dealt with. That was the harsh reality of frontier life. But wounding a cub and leaving it to die slowly was the kind of careless cruelty that made his stomach turn. Whatever else he'd become over the years, he'd always tried to make his kills clean and quick. "Why didn't you take him back to your people?" he asked. "Surely they could care for him better than you can alone out here." For the first time, the girl's composure wavered slightly. "My people have enough troubles without adding an orphan bear to them. The soldiers came to our camp 2 weeks ago, asking questions, counting our numbers. They say we have too many horses, that we're hiding weapons, that young men are slipping away to join the resistance fighters in Mexico." She stroked the cub's fur with gentle fingers. "A bear cub would be seen as just another mouth to feed. Another reason for the white authorities to say we're not managing our resources properly." The weight of history pressed down on the clearing like a physical thing. Thomas knew about the tensions between the army and the Apache tribes, knew how every possession, every animal, every decision was scrutinized for signs of potential uprising. He'd been part of that scrutiny more than once, hired to track Apache bands that had left their designated areas to recover stolen livestock that might or might not have actually been stolen. "So you thought you'd raise him yourself?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious now. "A grizzly bear?" "My grandmother raised a black bear once when she was young. Fed him goat's milk until he was old enough to find his own food, then released him into the mountains. She said he used to visit her camp sometimes, bringing her gifts of honey and fish." The girl's voice carried the warmth of a cherished story. "She taught me that all creatures deserve a chance to grow, to become what they're meant to be." Thomas lowered his rifle slightly, though he kept his finger near the trigger. And what if he grows up to be like his mother? What if he kills someone? What if he doesn't? She countered, meeting his eyes again. What if he becomes something different because someone showed him kindness instead of violence? What if the first lesson he learns about the world isn't that everything is something to fear or fight? The questions hung in the air between them, challenging assumptions Thomas had lived by for decades. In his world, dangerous things were eliminated before they could cause harm. It was simple, efficient, and had kept him alive through countless confrontations. But this girl was suggesting something else entirely. The compassion might be stronger than force. That mercy might achieve what violence never could. The cub finished eating and curled up against the girl's leg, already beginning to accept her as a source of safety and comfort. Thomas watched the little creature's complete trust, the way it settled into sleep despite the presence of its mother's body and a strange man with a gun. There was something profoundly moving about that trust, something that reminded him of how his own son had once fallen asleep in his arms, utterly confident that his father would keep him safe from all harm. "You can't stay out here," Thomas said, though he wasn't sure why he was offering advice instead of simply completing his mission. "There are other dangers besides men with guns. Wolves, mountain lions, Apache bands that might not take kindly to finding you alone in their territory." "I know the dangers," she replied calmly. "I've lived in these mountains all my life. People taught me to read the signs, to move quietly, to find water and shelter and food, even in the harshest seasons." She paused, studying his face. "But you're right that I can't stay here forever. Shash needs more care than I can give him alone, and winter is coming to the high country." Thomas found himself trapped between duty and something he couldn't quite identify. His employers expected him to return with proof that the grisly threat had been eliminated. They'd paid good money for his services, and his reputation depended on delivering what he promised. But looking at the scene before him, the brave girl, the orphan cub, the tragic end to a mother's protective love, he felt something stirring that he'd thought was long dead. "What's your name?" he asked suddenly. "Kaya," she replied. "It means my elder sister in my language. And you are Thomas Avery, the one they call Gray Wolf." Thomas startled at hearing his Apache nickname. He'd earned it during the wars of the 1870s, when his ability to track and strike without warning had made him feared among the tribal bands. But he hadn't heard it spoken in years, and certainly not by someone young enough to be his own daughter. "How do you know that name?" "Stories travel far in the desert, especially stories about death." Kaya's voice held no accusation, just sad acknowledgement. "My uncle fought against you during the Skeleton Canyon raids. He said you moved like smoke and struck like lightning, that you never missed what you aimed for and never left wounded enemies to suffer." The memory hit Thomas like a physical blow. Skeleton Canyon, where he tracked the band of Apache warriors who'd raided a settlement near Tombstone. The fight had been brief and vicious, ending with 7 men dead and Thomas carrying a bullet scar above his left hip that still ached in cold weather. He'd never known the names of the men he'd killed that day, had never thought of them as anything more than obstacles to be removed. "Your uncle," he said quietly. "What was his name?" "Goethle. You would have known him as runs with horses." Kaya's voice remained steady, but Thomas caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "He was trying to get back to his children when you found him. My cousins had been taken by soldiers and sent to the school in Carlisle. He was following their trail when your bullets found him." Thomas felt the ground shift beneath him, reality reshaping itself around this new information. Runs with horses hadn't been a warrior seeking battle. He'd been a father trying to rescue his children from the government schools that stripped away Apache culture and language, that forbade everything that made them who they were. Thomas had killed a man whose only crime was loving his family enough to risk everything for them. "I didn't know," Thomas said, the words feeling inadequate and hollow. "Of course you didn't. You never asked." Kaya's tone wasn't angry, just infinitely sad. "That's what war does. It turns people into targets instead of human beings. It makes us forget that everyone is someone's father, someone's son, someone's hope for the future." The bear cub stirred in its sleep, making small sounds that could have been contentment or distress. Kaya immediately adjusted her position to make it more comfortable, her movements automatic and caring. Thomas watched her tend to the orphaned animal and felt something break open inside his chest, a pain he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten it was there. He was a good man, Kaya continued, her hands gentle on the cub's fur. He taught me to track, to read the sky for weather, to find the hidden springs in the desert. He would have liked Shash, I think. He always said that children and young animals see the world as it truly is before we teach them to be afraid. Thomas understood now why this encounter felt different from all the others, why his finger refused to squeeze the trigger despite decades of training and habit. This wasn't just about a wounded bear and an orphan cub. It was about the weight of choices, the accumulated cost of a life lived without mercy or second thoughts. Kaya wasn't just protecting a small animal. She was offering him something he'd thought was lost forever. A chance to choose protection over destruction. A chance to be the man his wife had loved instead of the killer he'd become. The girl looked up at him again, and in her dark eyes, he saw not hatred for the man who'd killed her uncle, but something infinitely more powerful hope that he might choose differently this time. He's just a child too, she said again, her voice carrying all the weight of loss and forgiveness and stubborn faith in redemption. Thomas Avery, who had never missed a target he'd aimed for, who had killed more men than he could easily count, who had earned his reputation as an angel of death riding across the frontier. Thomas Avery slowly lowered his rifle. "Yes," he said, his voice rough with emotions he'd kept buried for years. "Yes, he is." The decision to lower his rifle felt like stepping off a cliff in the dark. Thomas had lived by the gun for so long that mercy felt foreign, unnatural, like trying to write with his offhand. But as he watched Kaya tend to the bear cub with such gentle care, he found himself remembering what it felt like to protect instead of destroy. "We need to bury her," Thomas said, nodding toward the dead grizzly. "It's not right to leave her for the scavengers." Kaya looked surprised. "You would do that? Honor an animal you came to kill? She died protecting her young. That deserves respect, no matter the species." Thomas shouldered his rifle and began looking around the clearing for suitable stones. "My father always taught me that taking any life carries responsibility. The least we can do is see her to rest properly." Working together, they gathered flat rocks from the mountainside and carefully covered the grizzly's body. It was hard work in the thin mountain air, and Thomas found himself breathing heavily as they placed the final stones. But there was something cleansing about the task, something that felt like making amends for intentions he'd carried but not acted upon. As they worked, Kaya spoke quietly about Apache burial customs, about how her people believed that all spirits deserved peace in their journey to the next world. Her words were accompanied by soft songs in her native language, melodies that seemed to drift on the mountain wind like prayers made audible. Around her left wrist, Thomas noticed a beaded bracelet that seemed particularly well crafted. The beadwork was intricate tiny shells and colored stones arranged in patterns that seemed to tell a story. When she caught him looking, Kaya held up her arm to display it more clearly. "It was my grandmother's," she explained, her fingers touching the beads with obvious affection. "She made it when I was born, but saved it for my 50th year. She said it would remind me that healing and forgiveness are the highest forms of wisdom." "Your grandmother sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. She could set bones, deliver babies, cure fevers that other healers couldn't touch. But more than that, she could see into people's hearts, could find the good even when it was buried deep under pain and anger. Kaya's voice grew thoughtful. "She told me once that every person carries two wolves inside them, one that feeds on hatred and revenge, and one that feeds on compassion and understanding. The one that grows strongest is the one you choose to feed." Thomas felt those words settle into his chest like seeds in fertile ground. For 30 years, he'd been feeding the wrong wolf, nurturing the part of himself that solved problems with violence, that saw the world in terms of threats to be eliminated. But sitting here in this mountain clearing, helping to honor a creature he'd intended to kill, he felt the other wolf stirring, the part of him that had once loved deeply, that had wanted to build instead of destroy. The bear cub had awakened and was exploring its surroundings with the careful curiosity of the very young. It sniffed at Thomas's boots, apparently unafraid despite the scent of gun oil and old blood that clung to him. When Kaya offered it another strip of dried meat, the little creature ate eagerly, already beginning to associate her with safety and sustenance. He's going to need regular feeding, Thomas observed, watching the cub's obvious hunger. And clean water, shelter from the weather. You can't provide all that alone out here. I know, Kaya admitted. I was hoping to keep him until he was strong enough to make it on his own. But you're right, winter comes early in these mountains, and a bear cub needs more protection than I can give. Thomas found himself studying her face, noting the determined set of her jaw despite the impossible situation she'd taken on. There was something about her courage that reminded him of Sarah, the way his wife had never backed down from what she believed was right, even when it meant going against convention or common sense. Your village, he said carefully. How far is it from here? Half a day's walk to the east. But I told you, they won't welcome a bear cub. There are too many other concerns right now. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, thinking. He'd spent years avoiding Apache settlements, viewing them as sources of potential conflict rather than communities of people trying to survive in an increasingly hostile world. But Kaya had shown him something different, had revealed depths of wisdom and compassion that challenged every assumption he'd carried about her people. What if I came with you? The words surprised him as much as they did her. Not as an enemy, but as someone seeking to understand. Maybe together we could convince your people that the cub deserves a chance. Kaya stared at him in amazement. You would do that? Enter an Apache village as a guest instead of a hunter? I owe it to your uncle, Thomas said quietly. And to you for showing me that there are other ways to solve problems besides killing them. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant lower through the pine trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. Thomas could see that Kaya was tired. She'd probably been awake most of the previous night, staying close to the wounded animals, offering what comfort she could. The weight of responsibility she'd taken on was enormous for someone so young, yet she carried it without complaint. There's a stream about a quarter mile down the slope, she said, pointing southeast. Good water and sheltered enough for a camp. We could rest there tonight. Let Shash gain some strength before we travel. Thomas nodded, already beginning to gather their few possessions. The decision felt momentous, like crossing a river that had no bridge back. Once he entered that Apache village, once he sat at their fires and shared their food, he could never go back to seeing them as faceless enemies. The comfortable certainties that had guided his life for so long would be forever changed. But as he watched Kaya carefully lift the bear cub and settle it against her shoulder, he found that the prospect didn't frighten him as much as it should have. For the first time in years, he was moving towards something instead of running away from it. The stream Kaya had mentioned proved to be everything she'd promised: clear water flowing over smooth stones, with a level area perfect for camping surrounded by sheltering boulders. Thomas unsaddled Patience and let her drink while Kaya found a warm spot for the bear cub among some fallen logs as evening settled over the mountains. They shared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack from Thomas's supplies, supplemented by wild onions and pine nuts that Kaya gathered with practiced ease. The cub ate steadily, already seeming stronger than it had that morning, and settled contentedly beside the small fire they'd built. Tell me about your grandmother, Thomas said, as they sat watching the flames dance. The one who raised the black bear. Kaya smiled, her face softening in the firelight. Her name was Desba, which means goes to war. But she was the gentlest person I ever knew. She said the name was given to her because she fought against hatred and ignorance wherever she found them. As she spoke about her grandmother's wisdom, about the healing traditions passed down through generations of Apache women, Thomas felt something loosening in his chest, a knot of anger and guilt that had been tightening for decades. Perhaps it wasn't too late to choose a different path. Perhaps redemption was still possible, even for a man like him. The bear cub slept peacefully between them, its small body rising and falling with each breath, trusting in their protection. Tomorrow they would begin a journey that would change everything Thomas thought he knew about himself and the world he'd inhabited for so long. But tonight, for the first time in years, he felt something that had been absent from his life for far too long. Hope. Dawn broke over the Chiricahua Mountains with the kind of crystalline clarity that made the desert air seem like something you could drink. Thomas woke to find the bear cub curled against his side, having abandoned Kaya's warmth sometime during the night for the unfamiliar comfort of the man who'd almost killed him. The irony wasn't lost on him in choosing mercy. He'd somehow earned the trust of the very creature he'd been hired to destroy. Kaya was already awake, sitting by the cold ashes of their fire and braiding her long hair with practiced fingers. She smiled when she saw the cub's chosen sleeping spot. "Shash knows a protector when he finds one," she said softly, careful not to wake the little bear. Animals see truth more clearly than people sometimes. They don't judge by past actions, only by present intentions. Thomas carefully extracted himself from under the sleeping cub and began preparing for the day's journey. His hands moved automatically through the familiar routine, checking his rifle, counting ammunition, examining Patience's hooves and tack bud. His mind was elsewhere, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. The ride east toward Kay's village took them through country that grew increasingly beautiful as the morning progressed. Ancient oak trees provided shade along stream beds, their branches heavy with acorns that would feed wildlife through the coming winter. Wildflowers bloomed in protected meadows, desert marigolds, fairy dusters, and ghost plants that seemed to glow in the early light. It was land worth fighting for, Thomas realized, worth dying for if necessary. As they traveled, Kaya shared stories of her people's connection to this place, how certain springs were sacred, how specific rock formations marked the sites of important events, how the mountains themselves were considered living entities deserving of respect and reverence. Her words painted a picture of a culture that saw the world not as something to be conquered and exploited, but as a partner in the ancient dance of survival. "My father used to bring me here when I was small," she said as they paused to rest, beside a clear pool fed by a natural spring. "He would show me which plants could heal and which could harm, where to find water even in the driest seasons, how to read the sky for changes in weather." Her voice grew sad. "He died 3 winters ago during the fever sickness that came through our village. Many of the elders passed that year, too much knowledge lost too quickly." Thomas heard the weight of responsibility in her words, the burden of being young in a culture under siege. The fever she mentioned had probably been brought by white settlers, another invisible weapon in the long war of expansion and displacement. How many traditions had died with those elders? How many stories would never be told again? The bear cub rode contentedly in an improvised sling across Kaya's shoulder, occasionally poking its head out to observe their surroundings with bright, curious eyes. Despite its recent trauma, the little creature seemed remarkably resilient, already beginning to play and explore whenever they stopped to rest. There was something hopeful about its recovery, something that spoke to the power of care and attention to heal even the deepest wounds. By midday, they could see smoke rising from cooking fires in the distance, thin gray columns that marked the location of Kaya's village. Thomas felt his stomach tighten with familiar pre-battle tension. The same feeling he'd carried into countless dangerous situations over the years. But this time was different. This time he was riding toward potential conflict, not as an aggressor, but as a supplicant seeking understanding. "Tell me about your chief," Thomas said, as they approached the outskirts of the settlement. "What kind of man is he?" "Chief Matu is wise and careful," Kaya replied. "His name means bear in our language fitting, considering our current companion. He fought against the cavalry in his younger days, but now he believes that survival requires adaptation, finding ways to live alongside the white world without losing what makes us Apache." The village appeared gradually through the trees, not the random collection of teepees Thomas had expected, but a carefully planned community of substantial dwellings built for permanence rather than mobility. Gardens flourished between the houses, and he could see children playing in the central area while women worked at various tasks nearby. It looked peaceful, prosperous even, nothing like the savage encampments described in newspaper accounts. Back east thought their arrival caused quite a stir. Thomas could see people stopping their work to stare at the unusual sight of Kaya returning with a white man and a bear cub. Warriors emerged from various dwellings, hands resting casually on knife hilts, their faces carefully neutral but alert. He recognized the posture. These were experienced fighters. Trying to determine whether he represented a threat, an older man stepped forward from the group, his bearing and the deference shown by others marking him clearly as a leader. Chief Matu was perhaps 60 years old, his gray-streaked hair braided with eagle feathers and his weathered face marked by intelligence and caution. He wore traditional Apache clothing, buckskin shirt and leggings, decorated with intricate beadwork. But Thomas noticed a cavalry saber hanging at his side, a trophy from some long-ago battle. "Kaya," the chief said, his English accented but clear, "you return with interesting companions." "Uncle," she replied respectfully, "this is Thomas Avery, the one some call Gray Wolf. He came to hunt the bear that was killed yesterday, but chose mercy over violence when he found Shash orphaned and alone." A murmur ran through the gathered crowd at the mention of Thomas's Apache name. He could see recognition in many faces. Not friendly recognition, but the wary acknowledgement accorded to a dangerous adversary. Several of the younger warriors shifted position slightly, placing themselves between Thomas and the children playing nearby. Chief Matu studied Thomas with eyes that seemed to see everything and judge nothing. "A gray wolf," he said finally. "Your reputation travels far in the desert. Some of our people have reason to fear that name." "I know," Thomas replied, dismounting slowly and keeping his hands visible. "I've done things I'm not proud of, made choices that hurt your people. But today I chose differently. Today I chose to protect instead of destroy." The chief's gaze shifted to the bear cub peering out from Kaya's shoulder, then back to Thomas's face. "And what do you seek here, Gray Wolf? What brings a hunter to our village as a guest instead of an enemy?" Thomas took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would determine whether this encounter ended in understanding or bloodshed. "I seek wisdom, Chief Matu. I seek to understand how a people can show such compassion to their enemies' children, while I've spent my life teaching fear through violence." The chief was quiet for a long moment, his hand resting on what Thomas now realized was not just a captured cavalry saber, but an elaborately carved pipa ceremonial piece used for important discussions and treaties. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Come," Chief Matu said, gesturing toward the center of the village. "Let us sit and speak of difficult things. Perhaps the spirits have brought you here for reasons we do not yet understand." As they walked toward what appeared to be a council area, Thomas felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon him. He was entering a world where his reputation preceded him like a shadow, where every step would be measured against years of violence and mistrust. But for the first time in his adult life, he was moving forward without the comfort of superior firepower or the certainty of moral righteousness. He was, quite literally, walking in faith that mercy could triumph over justice. That understanding could bridge the gap carved by generations of warfare. That even a man like him might find redemption in the most unlikely of places. The bear cub chose that moment to reach out from its perch and touch Thomas's hand with one small paw, a gesture of trust that didn't go unnoticed by the watching Apache. Perhaps, Thomas thought, even the smallest acts of compassion could change the world. The council area lay in the heart of the village, a circle of smooth stones arranged around a central fire pit that had clearly seen countless gatherings over the years. Chief Mato gestured for Thomas to sit on a woven mat across from him, while Kaya settled nearby with the bear cub still cradled in her arms. Other members of the tribe gathered in a wider circle: warriors, women, elders, and children, all coming to witness this unprecedented meeting. Thomas felt exposed under so many watchful eyes, acutely aware that he was probably the first white man to sit peacefully in this circle in years, perhaps decades. The weight of history pressed down on the gathering like a physical presence. All the battles fought, lives lost, promises broken between their peoples. Chief Mato began the formal proceedings by lighting his ceremonial pipe with a coal from the fire. The pipe was magnificent, its bowl carved from red stone, and its stem decorated with eagle feathers and bands of intricate silverwork. He drew deeply, then passed it to Thomas, who accepted it with hands that were steadier than he'd expected. "This pipe has been smoked by warriors and peacemakers for 3 generations, the chief explained. "My grandfather carried it when he met with General Crook in 1886. My father smoked it the day he decided to bring our people to this valley instead of fleeing to Mexico with Geronimo. Now it comes to you, Gray Wolf, as a symbol that some wounds can heal if we have the courage to let them." Thomas drew carefully on the pipe, tasting the complex mixture of tobacco and herbs, feeling the smoke burn his throat in an oddly cleansing way. When he passed it back to Chief Mato, he found that some of the tension in his shoulders had eased. "Tell us why you came here," an elderly woman said from the circle. Her hair was white as snow, and her face deeply lined, but her eyes were sharp and intelligent. "Tell us why the man who killed our sons now sits at our fire asking for wisdom." The directness of her challenge caught Thomas off guard. He'd expected formal politeness, diplomatic dancing around difficult topics. Instead, he found himself facing the raw truth of what his presence meant to these people. "Because I'm tired," he said simply. "Tired of carrying ghosts, tired of solving every problem with a bullet, tired of being the kind of man children run from instead of run to." He looked around the circle, meeting eyes that held pain but also curiosity. "Because a young woman showed me that courage sometimes means choosing to protect instead of destroy, and I want to learn how to be that kind of brave." Murmurs rippled through the gathering, some skeptical, others thoughtful. A younger warrior leaned forward, his face hard with old anger. "Pretty words from Gray Wolf," he said, spitting into the fire so it hissed and smoked. "But what of my brother, killed at Skeleton Canyon? What of the children orphaned by your bullets? Do you think sitting at our fire erases the blood on your hands?" Thomas felt the familiar urge to defend himself, to explain that he'd been following orders, that war made killers of everyone involved. But Kaya's earlier words echoed in his mind about feeding the right wolf, about choosing which part of yourself to strengthen. "No," he said quietly, "nothing can erase that blood. I can't bring back your brother or anyone else I've killed. I can't undo the choices I made or the pain I caused." He reached into his saddlebags and pulled out the leather-bound journal he'd carried for so many years. "But I can choose to stop adding to this." He held up the journal so the firelight illuminated its worn cover. "Every life I've taken is recorded in here. Every face, every name I could learn, Every reason I told myself it was necessary. 27 men, and I remember them all. His voice grew rough. I thought keeping track somehow made it honorable, made me different from ordinary killers. But sitting here now, looking at your faces, I realize I was just a fool trying to organize his sins into neat categories. An older man Thomas hadn't noticed before spoke from the shadows beyond the firelight. I am Chado, war leader of this band. I am some of those men you killed, Grey Wolf. Good men, bad men. Men caught between impossible choices just like you. He stepped forward into the light, revealing features marked by old battle scars. But I also know the stories of how you fought, that you never tortured prisoners, never harmed women or children, never took scalps or trophies. Even your enemies spoke of your honor. Honor, Thomas repeated bitterly. Is there honor in efficient killing? There is honor in fighting by rules when others abandon them, Chief Matu said thoughtfully. There is honor in remembering the humanity of your enemies even when duty requires their death. He gestured toward the journal in Thomas's hands. This book you carry, it weighs on you like stones, yes? You have been punishing yourself for years. Thomas nodded, unable to speak around the sudden tightness in his throat. It was true. The journal had become both confession and penance. A burden he carried, because forgetting seemed like the greater sin. My people believe that guilt unexpressed becomes poison in the soul, Chief Matu continued. But guilt shared, acknowledged, transformed into wisdom that can become medicine for the whole community. He paused, studying Thomas's face. Perhaps it is time to transform your poison into medicine. The bear cub chose that moment to wake up and begin exploring the circle, sniffing curiously at various people and generally charming everyone it encountered. Even the hard-faced young warrior smiled when the little creature climbed onto his lap and began examining his braid with tiny paws. Shash seems to approve of our gathering, Kaya observed with amusement. Perhaps he understands something we, adults, are still learning. As the evening progressed, the formal council atmosphere gradually relaxed into something more intimate. People began sharing their own stories, tales of loss and survival, of difficult choices made in desperate times, of learning to live with decisions that couldn't be undone. Thomas found himself talking about Sarah and Daniel, about the fever that had taken his son and the way grief had hardened his heart until violence became easier than vulnerability. When he spoke of finding Sarah's photograph in his saddlebags hidden beneath maps and ammunition, but never forgotten, several of the women made soft sounds of sympathy. The picture was old and creased, showing a young woman with laughing eyes and a small boy who looked just like his father. She was beautiful, Kaya said, studying the photograph by firelight. And your son, he has your eyes but her smile. Had, Thomas corrected gently. They've both been gone 8 years now. Gone from this world, an elderly Apache woman said, firmly, but not gone from your heart. The love you carry for them that is still alive, still part of who you are. Perhaps they sent you here to remember how to love again, instead of just remembering how to mourn. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow, opening something inside him that had been sealed shut for years. He found himself crying for the first time since Sarah's funeral, not the angry, bitter tears of a man raging against fate, but the cleansing sorrow of someone finally allowing himself to grieve fully. Around the fire, the Apache people sat in respectful silence, honoring his pain, without trying to fix it or explain it away. It was, Thomas realized, perhaps the greatest gift anyone had given him in years. The simple recognition that some wounds needed to be acknowledged before they could heal. As the night deepened and the fire burned lower, Thomas felt something shifting inside him, some long frozen part of his soul beginning to thaw. The path ahead was still uncertain, still fraught with dangers and difficult choices. But for the first time in 8 years, he was no longer walking it alone. The next morning brought a crisp autumn clarity to the mountains, the kind of weather that made the high desert seem infinite and full of promise. Thomas woke to find himself covered with a warm blanket he didn't remember receiving, and the bear cub curled contentedly between him and the dying embers of the council fire. Around the circle, other members of the tribe were beginning their day with quiet efficiency, tending fires, preparing food, caring for children and animals with the practiced grace of people who lived in harmony with their environment. Ka appeared with a bowl of pine nut porridge and strips of venison that had been slow cooked through the night. "Sleep well, Grey Wolf," she asked with a gentle smile. "Better than I have in years," Thomas admitted, surprised to find it was true. Something about the peaceful sounds of the village, the knowledge that he was protected rather than hunting, had allowed him to rest in a way he'd almost forgotten was possible. Chief Matu approached carrying a small leather pouch and what appeared to be a collection of smooth stones marked with intricate symbols. "If you are willing," he said, settling beside the fire, "I would like to share something with you. These are story stones, passed down from my great-grandfather's time. They tell the old tales, how the world was made, how all living things are connected, how even enemies can become family if they choose the path of understanding." Thomas set down his bowl and gave the chief his full attention. In his years of fighting Apache warriors, he'd never been offered a glimpse into their spiritual beliefs, their understanding of the world's deeper patterns. It felt like a privilege beyond anything he'd earned. The chief spread the stones in a complex pattern, each one catching the morning light to reveal carved symbols that seemed to dance with meaning. "This stone," he said, touching one marked with intertwining spirals, speaks of the great web that connects all things. When you harm one part of the web, vibrations travel throughout the whole structure. When you heal one part, that healing also spreads." As Chief Matu spoke, other members of the tribe gathered around to listen. Thomas noticed that even the youngest children seemed familiar with these stories, their faces showing the deep attention that comes from hearing beloved tales repeated over generations. It was a kind of education he'd never experienced, learning not from books or lectures, but from the living voices of elders who had walked these mountains for decades. "Your people see the world differently than ours," the chief continued, selecting another stone marked with angular patterns. "You seek to own land, to possess animals, to control the forces of nature. But this stone teaches that we are not owners. We are participants in a dance that began before our ancestors were born, and will continue long after our children's children have joined the spirits." Thomas found himself thinking of his own childhood in Kentucky, where his father had taught him to hunt and fish, but also to respect the creatures they killed, to take only what was needed and waste nothing. Somehow, in the years of war and violence that followed, he'd lost that deeper understanding, reducing the world to targets and threats instead of seeing it as a living system that demanded reverence. A young woman approached carrying a baby who couldn't have been more than a few months old. She spoke quietly to Kaya in Apache, gesturing toward the bear cub, then smiled shyly at Thomas. She asks if her son can meet Shash, Kaya translated. She believes that children who encounter bear spirits in their first year will be blessed with courage and wisdom. Thomas watched in amazement as the woman gently guided her baby's tiny hand to touch the bear cub's soft fur. The little creature seemed to understand the solemnity of the moment, sitting perfectly still while the infant explored his fuzzy ears and warm nose. The baby gurgled with delight, completely unafraid of the wild animal that had been born to become one of nature's most formidable predators. "How do they know he won't hurt the child?" Thomas asked. "Because Shash was saved by compassion instead of conquered by violence," Chief Matu replied. His first lesson about the human world was that some people choose protection over harm. That lesson will shape everything he becomes. The profound implications of those words settled over Thomas like a physical weight. If the bear cub's future had been shaped by a single act of mercy, What did that say about the children who had witnessed his own years of violence? How many young Apache warriors had learned to see all white men as enemies because of battles he'd fought, lives he'd taken? But perhaps, he thought hopefully, the reverse was also true. Perhaps choosing mercy now, in front of this gathering, might plant different seeds in young minds, the possibility that even old enemies could change. That understanding could triumph over fear. As the day progressed, Thomas found himself drawn into the daily life of the village in ways he'd never expected. He helped repair a damaged lodge, his frontier skills with rope and leather proving useful despite the cultural differences. He assisted with caring for the horses, discovering that Apache methods of training emphasize partnership rather than domination. Most surprisingly, he found himself teaching some of the young warriors about tracking techniques, sharing knowledge gained through years of hunting both animals and men. "You move like a ghost," one young man observed as Thomas demonstrated how to step silently on loose gravel. "No wonder they call you Gray Wolf." "The trick isn't moving without sound," Thomas explained. "It's moving with intention, making every step deliberate instead of hurried. Fear makes noise, confidence moves quietly." As afternoon faded into evening, disturbing news arrived with a scout who had been watching the approaches to the valley. He spoke rapidly to Chief Motto in Apache, his words clearly urgent. Thomas didn't understand the language, but he recognized the tone trouble approaching, decisions needing to be made quickly. Chief Motto's face grew grave as he listened to the report. When the scout finished speaking, the chief turned to address the gathered villagers, his voice carrying the authority of leadership earned through decades of difficult choices. "A cavalry patrol approaches from the south," he announced. 40 men, well-armed and moving with purpose. They carry the flag of truce, but also the authority to enforce government decisions about our presence here. Thomas felt his stomach clench with familiar pre-battle tension. In his experience, military patrols rarely brought good news to Apache settlements, especially ones that emphasized their authority while offering to negotiate. "How far out?" he asked, his tactical mind automatically assessing threats and options. "They will reach us by tomorrow evening," Chief Motto replied. "Perhaps sooner if they push their horses hard." The peaceful atmosphere of the village suddenly felt fragile, precious, like something that might be shattered by forces beyond their control. Thomas looked around at the faces surrounding him, people who had shown him unprecedented kindness, who had offered wisdom and forgiveness when he'd expected only hostility. For the first time since arriving, he found himself thinking not about what he might gain from this experience, but about what he might be able to give in return. These people had shown him a different way of being in the world, had begun to heal wounds he'd carried for years. If that healing was about to be threatened, perhaps it was time for Gray Wolf to become protector instead of predator. The bear cub, as if sensing the change in mood, pressed closer to Kaya and made small, worried sounds. She stroked his fur gently, whispering reassurances in Apache, but Thomas could see the concern in her dark eyes. Tomorrow would bring new choices, new tests of the man he was trying to become. Tonight, he would hold on to the peace they'd found together and prepare for whatever challenges lay ahead. That evening, as Thomas prepared his bedroll near the council fire, a gust of wind scattered some papers from his saddlebags across the ground. He moved quickly to gather the maps, supply lists, nothing that should concern anyone. But as he reached for the last sheet, Kaya's hand closed over it first. She held the document up to the firelight, her face growing pale as she read. When she looked up at Thomas, her dark eyes held a mixture of hurt and betrayal that cut him deeper than any bullet ever could. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas felt his heart sink as he recognized the paper military orders bearing the seal of Fort Huachuca, written in the precise language of official correspondence. Orders he'd forgotten he was carrying. Orders that suddenly made his presence in this peaceful village seemed like something far more sinister than a chance encounter. "Kaya, I can explain. Can you?" She stood slowly, the document trembling in her hands. "Can you explain why you carry orders to map Apache settlements for a future military action? Can you explain why your hunting expedition was supposed to include detailed reports on village defenses, water sources, and escape routes?" The words hit the gathered Apache like physical blows. Thomas could see understanding dawn on face after face as the implications became clear. Chief Mato rose from his place by the fire, his expression carefully controlled, but his eyes burning with barely contained anger. "Read it aloud," the chief commanded quietly. "Let everyone hear what Grey Wolf's true mission was." Kaya's voice shook as she translated the military orders. The document was coldly efficient in its language, ordering Thomas to use his hunting contract as cover for reconnaissance operations. He was to identify defensive positions, count warriors, assess the tribe's ability to resist forced relocation, and report back with recommendations for the most effective military approach. The bear hunt had been secondary, almost an afterthought, compared to his primary mission of gathering intelligence for what the orders euphemistically called future pacification operations. "The wounded grizzly was perfect cover," Thomas said, his voice hollow as the full scope of his deception became clear even to himself. "No one questions a hunter tracking dangerous game. I could go anywhere, see everything, and my presence would seem completely justified." Young warriors who had been teaching him Apache tracking techniques now looked at him with disgust. Women who had shared stories of their children pulled back protectively. Even the elders, who had shown him such patient wisdom, regarded him with the wariness reserved for poisonous snakes. "How long?" Chief Mato asked, his voice cutting through the shocked silence. "How long have you been preparing to betray us?" Thomas wanted to lie, to minimize his involvement, to find some way to make this seem less damning than it was. But looking at Kaya's tear-filled eyes, remembering her grandmother's bracelet and her stories of healing and forgiveness, he found he couldn't add more deception to the weight he was already carrying. 3 weeks, he admitted. "I was contacted by Colonel Morrison at Fort Huachuca 3 weeks ago. He said the government needed better intelligence on Apache settlements that might pose problems for the new railway surveys. The bear attack gave them the perfect excuse to send me into your territory." "And you agreed," Kaya said, not asking but stating a fact that hurt her to speak. "You agreed to spy on us, to help them plan our destruction, to betray the very people who showed you kindness." "I agreed because it was a job," Thomas said miserably. "Because I needed the money and didn't think beyond that. Because I'd been thinking of Apache people as problems to be solved instead of ... He gestured helplessly around the circle. "Instead of this. Instead of families and children and elders with wisdom I'd never imagined." The hurt in Kaya's eyes was transforming into something harder, more dangerous. "Everything you said, everything you shared with us, was any of it real? Or were you just gathering information, learning our weaknesses so you could report them to your military friends?" "It was real," Thomas said desperately. "Everything I told you about Sarah and Daniel, about being tired of violence, about wanting to choose differently, all of that was true. The orders were just..." He struggled to find words that didn't sound like excuses. They were from before. From when I was still the man I used to be. Before you became enlightened by our hospitality? The young warrior who had challenged him the previous night stepped forward, his hand resting on his knife hilt. "Before you discovered that we were human beings worthy of your consideration?" Chief Matu raised a hand to forestall any violence. But his face was stone. "Show me your maps," he commanded. "Show me what you have recorded about our defenses, our people, our sacred places." With hands that felt like lead, Thomas retrieved his cartography supplies from his saddlebags. The maps he'd been creating were detailed and thorough, accurate. to the point that would make them invaluable to any military force planning an assault. Water sources, natural defensive positions, the locations of food stores and ammunition caches, even rough estimates of fighting age males and their probable weapons. Everything a competent scout would need to help an army destroy this peaceful community. Thorough work, Chief Motto observed, his voice deadly quiet, very professional. You have earned your payment well, Graveoff. I haven't sent any reports, Thomas said quickly. I haven't contacted Fort Huachuca since I arrived here. They're expecting communication, but I haven't, because you found a better way to gather intelligence. Chato interrupted, stepping out of the shadows with several other warriors flanking him. Become our friend, earn our trust, learn our secrets from the inside. Very clever. Thomas felt the walls of understanding he'd spent days building come crashing down around him. Everything he'd experienced here, the acceptance, the forgiveness, the sense of belonging he'd found, was being recontextualized through the lens of his original mission. How could he expect them to believe his transformation was genuine when he carried the evidence of his deception in his own saddlebags? The cavalry patrol approaching tomorrow, Kaya said, the pieces clicking together in her mind. You were supposed to guide them here, weren't you? Lead them straight to our village. While we trusted you as a friend. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Thomas realized with dawning horror that she was probably right. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Colonel Morrison had likely dispatched the patrol based on Thomas's expected timetable, planning for him to complete his reconnaissance and be ready to serve as guide when military action commenced. They think I'm still working for them, Thomas said, the full implications finally becoming clear. They're coming here expecting to find me ready to help them attack this village. And will you? Chief Motto asked, his hand moving to rest on his ceremonial pipe, but Thomas noticed it was positioned where he could easily draw the cavalry saber beneath it. When your Colonel Morrison arrives, will you remember your duty to the government that pays you, or will you honor the trust we showed you here? The question cut to the heart of everything Thomas had been wrestling with since that moment in the clearing when Kaya had said, he's just a child too. Here was the ultimate test of his claimed transformation, not words around a peaceful fire, but a choice between loyalty and conscience when lives hung in the balance. The bear cub, sensing the tension in the air, had retreated to Kaya's side and was making small, distressed sounds. She gathered the little creature close, her movements protective and fierce despite her obvious pain at Thomas's betrayal. I won't help them, Thomas said, his voice growing stronger as the decision crystallized in his mind. I won't guide them here, won't assist in any military action against your people. He stopped, realizing the magnitude of what he was contemplating. I'll warn you instead. Help you prepare defenses, evacuation routes if necessary. Pretty words, Chato said skeptically. But why should we believe the man who has already deceived us once? How do we know this isn't just another layer of your deception? Thomas looked around the circle at faces that had been friendly just hours before, now closed and suspicious. He thought of the journal in his saddlebags, the careful record of every life he'd taken, every choice that had led him to this moment of reckoning. Because, he said, reaching into his shirt and pulling out the folded military orders, you can watch me burn these. Without another word, he threw the documents into the fire. The papers caught immediately, their edges curling and blackening as flames consumed the evidence of his original mission. But even as the orders turned to ash, Thomas knew that destroying them wouldn't be enough to rebuild the trust he'd shattered. The real test would come tomorrow, when he had to choose between the man he'd been and the man he wanted to become. And this time, there would be no going back. The flames that consumed Thomas's military orders cast dancing shadows across the circle of faces, but the gesture felt hollow in the face of such profound betrayal. Burning papers couldn't erase the maps he'd drawn, couldn't undo the intelligence he'd gathered, couldn't restore the trust that had been shattered by the revelation of his true purpose. Chief Matu studied the ashes with an expression that revealed nothing. Words and fire are easy, Grey Wolf. Tomorrow we'll test what lies beneath them. The council dissolved into urgent discussions conducted in rapid Apache, leaving Thomas isolated by the dying fire with only his guilt for company. Kaya had disappeared, with the bear cub, unable to even look at him after the magnitude of his deception became clear. The village that had welcomed him now felt like enemy territory, every glance a reminder of how thoroughly he'd betrayed their hospitality. Unable to sleep, Thomas spent the night walking the perimeter of the settlement, his mind wrestling with the impossible choice that awaited him. When dawn broke gray and cold over the mountains, he found Chief Mata waiting for him by the horse corrals, the older man's face grave with the weight of necessary decisions. "The cavalry will be here by evening," the chief said without preamble. 40 soldiers led by Colonel Morrison himself, according to our scouts. They're well armed and moving with the confidence of men who expect no resistance. Thomas felt his stomach clench at the mention of Morrison's name. The colonel was no frontier amateur, but a career soldier with a reputation for efficiency in Indian affairs, a euphemism for the brutal suppression of native resistance. If Morrison was leading this operation personally, it meant the government viewed this Apache settlement as a significant priority. "What will you do?" Thomas asked. "What my people have always done when faced with impossible odds," Chief Mata replied. "We will adapt, survive, protect what matters most." He paused, studying Thomas's face. "The question is what you will do when your former employer arrives expecting your cooperation." Thomas had been asking himself the same question throughout the sleepless night. The old Thomas Avery would have honored his contract, fulfilled his obligations to the men who paid him, maintained his reputation for reliability regardless of personal feelings. But the man who had sat around the Apache fire, who had listened to their stories and shared their food, who had watched Kaya tend to an orphaned bear cub with such gentle care, the man couldn't stand by while these people were destroyed. "I meant what I said last night," Thomas replied. "I won't help them. Whatever it costs me, whatever happens to my reputation or my prospects, I won't be part of attacking this village." Chief Mata nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. "And if they order you to guide them here anyway? If they threaten to charge you with dereliction of duty or treason?" Thomas thought of his worn leather journal, of all the entries documenting lives taken in service to authority and law. For 30 years, he'd followed orders and fulfilled contracts because he'd believed that duty was its own justification, that loyalty to employers and government absolved him of responsibility for the consequences of his actions. But Kaya's words echoed in his memory. He's just a child, too. Some things were more important than duty. Some choices couldn't be justified by appeals to authority or necessity. "Then I'll face those consequences," Thomas said. "I've spent too many years being the kind of man who follows orders without questioning where they lead. Maybe it's time to be the kind who stands up for what's right, regardless of the cost." The chief's weathered face showed something that might have been approval. "Come with me," he said. "There are things you should see if you truly mean to stand with us." Chief Mata led him through the village to a large lodge near its center, one Thomas hadn't been invited to enter during his previous days among the Apache. Inside, he found a gathering of the community's senior warriors and leaders. Their faces grim, with the reality of their situation. Dot maps were spread across the floor. Not the crude sketches Thomas might have expected, but detailed cartographic work that would have impressed military engineers. The Apache had been conducting their own reconnaissance for years, tracking cavalry movements, identifying supply routes, planning for the day when their peaceful existence might be threatened. "You are not the first scouts sent to gather intelligence about us," Chato explained, noting Thomas's surprise. "We have known for months that the government was planning action against our settlement. Your arrival simply confirmed what our own watchers had already reported." Thomas felt a chill of understanding. The Apache hadn't been naive about his presence. They'd known from the beginning that he represented a potential threat. Their acceptance of him, their willingness to share their stories and traditions, had been an act of calculated courage rather than innocent trust. "Why didn't you expose me immediately?" he asked. "Because my grandmother taught me that even enemies can become family if given the chance," Kaya said from the lodge entrance, the bear cub cradled in her arms. Her voice was carefully controlled, but Thomas could hear the pain beneath it. "Because I believed that mercy might transform you into someone worthy of the trust we offered." The reproach in her words stung worse than any physical blow. Thomas realized that his deception had wounded more than just strategic relationships. It had hurt someone who had shown him unprecedented kindness, who had risked her own standing in the community to advocate for his acceptance. "Kaya, save your apologies," she interrupted, though not unkindly. "Show us, instead. If you truly mean to stand with us against the soldiers who are coming, then help us plan our defense." Over the next several hours, Thomas found himself drawn into tactical discussions unlike any he'd experienced. The Apache approach to warfare was fundamentally different from European military doctrine, emphasizing mobility over fixed positions, misdirection over direct confrontation, survival over conquest. They fought not to destroy their enemies, but to protect their families, to preserve their way of life in the face of overwhelming odds. Thomas's military experience proved valuable, but not in the way he'd expected. Rather than planning attacks, he found himself helping design evacuations, routes that would allow the most vulnerable members of the community to escape if the military force proved too strong to resist. His knowledge of cavalry tactics helped him prepare countermeasures, ways to slow pursuing forces and create opportunities for the entire village to reach safety. "The children and elders will leave at first light," Chief Mato explained, pointing to a mountain path that led deeper into Apache territory. "If we cannot negotiate a peaceful resolution, they will at least be beyond reach of Morrison's soldiers." Thomas noticed that his own maps, the intelligence he'd gathered during his deception, had been incorporated into the Apache planning. The defensive positions he'd identified were being prepared as fallback points. The water sources he'd noted were being secured against potential poisoning. The escape routes he'd recorded were being improved and provisioned for emergency use. His betrayal was being transformed into protection, his espionage converted into intelligence that might save lives rather than cost them. It was a kind of redemption he'd never imagined possible. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Chief Mato approached Thomas with something wrapped in soft deerskin. "If you truly mean to stand with us," he said formally, "then accept this as a symbol of your commitment." Inside the wrapping was a sacred medicine bundle, a collection of stones, feathers, and herbs bound with intricate cordwork and blessed according to Apache tradition. Thomas recognized it as an honor beyond anything he'd earned, a gesture of acceptance that cut across all the barriers of race and history that divided their peoples. "I can't accept this," Thomas said, overwhelmed by the significance of the gift. "I don't deserve. Deserve has nothing to do with it," Chief Mato interrupted. "This bundle belonged to my son, killed in the cavalry raid at Apache Pass 12 years ago. He was carrying it when he died protecting his younger sister from Morrison's soldiers." The chief's voice grew heavy with memory. "Now it passes to another warrior who chooses to protect rather than destroy." Thomas accepted the bundle, with hands that trembled slightly, feeling the weight of responsibility it represented. This wasn't just a ceremonial gift, it was a challenge, a reminder that his choice to stand with the Apache would be measured not in words but in actions. A scout appeared at the lodge entrance, his urgent whisper cutting through the planning. Discussions. The cavalry force had been spotted approaching the valley mouth, moving faster than expected. They would arrive within hours rather than at evening, giving the Apache much less time to complete their preparations. Morrison must suspect something, Chado observed grimly. Either that, or he's more eager for this confrontation than we anticipated. Thomas felt the familiar pre-battle tension begin to settle over the lodge as warriors checked weapons and reviewed final plans. But this time was different. This time he would be fighting alongside people he'd grown to respect and care about, defending a community that had shown him possibilities he'd never imagined. As the Apache prepared for what might be their final hours in this peaceful valley, Thomas made his own preparations. He took his leather journal, the record of 30 years of violence, and tore out every page, feeding them one by one to the lodge fire. Each sheet curled and blackened as it burned, releasing him from the weight of sins he could never undo, but no longer had to carry. When the last page had turned to ash, Thomas felt lighter than he had in years. Whatever happened when Morrison arrived, he would face it as a new man. Someone who had learned that real courage meant protecting the innocent rather than eliminating the inconvenient. The bear cub, seeming to sense the change in the air, pressed closer to Kaya and made small, worried sounds. She stroked his fur gently, whispering reassurances in Apache, but Thomas could see the fear in her eyes. Tonight would test everything they'd built together. Tonight would determine whether mercy could triumph over force, whether understanding could bridge the chasms carved by generations of warfare. Thomas adjusted the sacred medicine bundle at his belt and prepared to find out what kind of man he truly was. The cavalry arrived like a thunderclap against the mountain silence. 40 mounted soldiers in dust-covered blue uniforms riding into the valley with the confidence of men who expected no real resistance. At their head rode Colonel Morrison, a tall, lean man with steel-gray hair and the kind of military bearing that spoke of decades commanding other men in violent enterprises. Thomas watched from the ridge, above the village as the column approached, his heart hammering with the knowledge that everything he'd once believed about duty and loyalty was about to be tested in the crucible of actual conflict. The sacred medicine bundle at his belt felt heavier than any weapon he'd ever carried. Morrison called a halt at the edge of Apache territory and raised a white flag, the traditional signal for parley, though Thomas knew from experience that such gestures often masked less honorable intentions. The colonel's voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air as he shouted his demands. I call for Thomas Avery, scout in service to the United States Army, to present himself for debriefing and consultation. Below in the village, Thomas saw Chief Motto emerge from his lodge and begin walking slowly toward the cavalry line. Several Apache warriors flanked him, their weapons visible but not immediately threatening. The chief carried his ceremonial pipe, but Thomas noticed the cavalry saber was positioned for quick access if negotiations failed. Thomas took a deep breath and began making his way down the mountainside toward what might be his final confrontation with the life he'd lived for 30 years. As he walked, he was acutely aware of the Apache families watching from their lodges, women holding children close, elders preparing for whatever might come, young warriors ready to fight for their homes and way of life. Colonel Morrison's face showed surprise and then anger as Thomas appeared not from the cavalry ranks but from the Apache village, walking alongside Chief Motto as an apparent ally rather than an intelligence asset. Avery, Morrison barked. What the hell are you doing? Report to me immediately. Thomas stopped just outside easy rifle range, close enough to speak but far enough to avoid any sudden aggressive moves from the cavalry troopers. I'm exactly where I choose to be, Colonel. These people have shown me hospitality, and I won't repay it with betrayal. Morrison's face flushed with anger and disbelief. You're under contract to the United States Army, soldier. You have orders to... I had orders, Thomas interrupted, his voice carrying more strength than he'd felt in years. "Orders I've decided not to follow. I've seen what you're planning here, Morrison, and I won't be part of it." The colonel's hand moved to his sidearm, but Chief Mata stepped forward with the calm authority of a man accustomed to diffusing dangerous situations. "Colonel Morrison," the chief said formally, "you are welcome to approach under the flag of truce to discuss your business here. But I will remind you that this is Apache territory, recognized by treaty as sovereign land." "Treaties made with savages," Morrison snarled, but he didn't draw his weapon. "Treaties that become meaningless when those same savages harbor deserters and traitors." Thomas felt the familiar surge of combat adrenaline as the situation balanced on the knife's edge between negotiation and violence. He could see cavalry, soldiers checking their weapons, Apache warriors shifting position to provide better defensive coverage. One wrong word, one sudden movement, and the mountain valley would erupt in gunfire. "I'm no deserter," Thomas said clearly. "I fulfilled my scouting contract by tracking the grizzly that was killing livestock. That bear is dead. My job is done." "Your job," Morrison replied with cold fury, "was to provide intelligence on this settlement's defenses, population, and strategic value. Intelligence I need to complete my mission here." "What mission is that, exactly?" Chief Matu asked, his voice deceptively mild. "What brings 40 armed soldiers to a peaceful Apache village that has violated no treaties and threatened no settlements?" Morrison's smile was predatory. "Railroad survey crews will be working through this valley starting next month. The government needs assurance that they won't face hostile interference from local tribes. Your people will be relocated to more appropriate reservations where they can be properly supervised." The words hung in the mountain air like the smell of gunpowder before a battle. Thomas understood now why Morrison had been so insistent on detailed intelligence. This wasn't just a military operation, but an eviction, designed to clear Apache families from land that corporate interests had decided to claim. "This valley has been our home for 3 generations, Chief Mata said with quiet dignity. "Our children are buried here, our ceremonies conducted here, our lives built around these mountains and streams. We will not abandon it for the convenience of railroad companies." "You'll abandon it or be removed," Morrison replied bluntly. "The only question is whether that removal happens peacefully or requires more forceful measures." Thomas saw the bear cub peek out from behind Kaya's legs, the little creature seeming to sense the tension crackling through the air. The sight of that small, vulnerable life, depending on their protection, crystallized everything he'd been wrestling with since that first moment in the mountain clearing. "Colonel," Thomas said, stepping forward slightly, "these people have committed no crimes. They've honored every treaty, caused no trouble for anyone. What you're planning here isn't law enforcement. It's theft." Morrison's eyes narrowed as he studied his former scout. "You've been compromised, Avery, seduced by savage propaganda into forgetting your duty to civilization." "No," Thomas replied, his hand moving instinctively to rest on the sacred medicine bundle at his belt. "I've been reminded what civilization actually means. It means protecting the innocent, honoring agreements, treating other human beings with dignity regardless of their race or culture." The colonel's patience was clearly exhausted. "Last chance, Avery. Return to your duties or face the consequences of treason." Thomas looked around at the Apache faces surrounding him, people who had shown him kindness despite every reason to view him as an enemy, who had offered him wisdom and acceptance when he deserved neither. He thought of Kaya's grandmother, who had taught that healing and forgiveness were the highest forms of wisdom. He thought of the bear cub, saved by mercy instead of condemned by fear. "Then I guess," Thomas said quietly, "we'll see what those consequences look like." Morrison's face went rigid with fury at Thomas's defiance. The colonel raised his hand in a sharp gesture. and immediately the cavalry troopers behind him began spreading into attack formation at the movement Thomas recognized from countless previous engagements. The time for negotiation had ended. "So be it," Morrison snarled. Sergeant Williams placed Thomas Avery under arrest for treason and dereliction of duty. Consider any resistance as hostile action requiring appropriate response. The sergeant spurred his horse forward, but Thomas was already moving, using skills honed through decades of frontier survival. He dove sideways behind a boulder just as the first rifle shots cracked across the valley. The peaceful mountain air suddenly filled with the deadly whisper of bullets and the sharp reports of military carbines. Chief Matto and his warriors scattered. With practiced efficiency, each man moving to predetermined positions that Thomas's own intelligence had helped them prepare. The irony wasn't lost on him. His betrayal was now being used to save the very people he'd originally been sent to destroy. From his position behind the boulder, Thomas could see Kaya running toward the village with the bear cub clutched protectively in her arms. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who knew every rock and tree in these mountains. But Thomas's heart clenched as he realized she was heading directly into the crossfire between cavalry positions and Apache defensive lines. A young trooper appeared around the edge of his boulder, carbine raised and finger on the trigger. For a split second, Thomas looked into eyes that couldn't have been much older than his own son would have been, and felt the familiar cold calculation of kill or be killed settle over him. But this time, instead of reaching for his pistol, he grabbed a handful of dirt and threw it into the soldier's face, then tackled him to the ground in a wrestling match that ended with the young man unconscious, but breathing. The white feather Kaya had given him that morning was tucked into his hatband, a symbol of peace and new life that felt like a talisman against the violence erupting around him. As bullets whined overhead and men shouted orders in both English and Apache, Thomas found himself fighting not to kill but to protect, using his tactical knowledge to help Apache warriors outmaneuver cavalry charges rather than to eliminate enemies. From somewhere behind the Apache lines came a sound that made Thomas's blood run cold, the deep, rumbling roar of a mature grizzly bear. Through the gun-smoking chaos, he caught a glimpse of massive brown fur moving through the trees with deadly purpose. The mother bear, wounded but not dead, had returned to the valley where her cub was threatened. The timing couldn't have been more perfect or more terrifying. The grizzly emerged from the forest just as a squad of cavalry troopers was attempting to flank the Apache position, and her appearance scattered the horses in panic. Trained war horses that had faced Apache warriors without flinching reared and bolted when confronted by 800 pounds of enraged maternal fury. Morrison himself found his mount bucking wildly as the bear charged directly toward the sound of gunfire, following some primal instinct to protect her young. The colonel managed to stay in his saddle but lost control of his tactical situation as his carefully planned assault dissolved into chaos. Thomas used the confusion to work his way closer to the village where he could see Apache families moving toward the evacuation routes they'd prepared. His knowledge of cavalry tactics told him that Morrison would try to regroup and establish a perimeter, cutting off escape routes and forcing a siege situation that would inevitably favor the better armed military force. But the grizzly had changed everything. The massive bear was moving through the cavalry positions like a force of nature, not targeting anyone specifically, but creating panic and confusion wherever she appeared. Horses screamed and reared, soldiers scattered, and the neat military formation Morrison had counted on disintegrated into individual survival struggles. Kaya appeared at Thomas's elbow, having somehow circled back through the chaos. The bear cub was still clutched against her chest, making small, distressed sounds at the violence surrounding them. "The mother bear," she gasped, pointing toward the massive brown shape moving through the trees. She followed Shash's scent back. "Here, she's trying to find her baby." Thomas understood immediately. The wounded grizzly's maternal instincts had brought her back to the valley despite her injuries, drawn by the cub's cries and scent. In her pain and confusion, she was striking out at anything that seemed to threaten her young, which at the moment included an entire cavalry unit. "We need to get Shash to her," Thomas said, ducking as another volley of rifle fire cracked overhead. "If she can see her cub is safe, maybe she'll lead him away from the fighting." It was a desperate plan, requiring them to move through an active battle zone while carrying a bear cub toward its 800-pound mother. But as Thomas watched Apache families fleeing toward the mountain passes, as he saw young warriors falling under cavalry fire, he realized that desperate measures might be their only hope. "Stay close to me," he told Kaya, checking his rifle one final time. "And hold on to that cub like your life depends on it, because it probably does." Together, they began working their way through the chaos toward the place where mother and child might be reunited and where the battle for the future of this peaceful valley would be decided once and for all. The reunion between mother bear and cub happened in the eye of the storm, a moment of profound peace amid the chaos of battle. As Thomas and Kaya approached through the gunsmoke and confusion, the massive grizzly caught sight of her offspring and immediately abandoned her rampage through the cavalry lines. The great bear's roar softened to something almost like a purr as she nuzzled the cub that Kaya carefully placed on the ground between them. For a heartbeat, predator and prey, Apache and white man, all stood transfixed by the simple power of a mother's love reunited with her child. The bear cub tumbled toward his mother with joyful squeaks, completely unafraid despite the violence surrounding them. The grizzly examined every inch of her baby, sniffing for injuries, reassuring herself that he was whole and safe. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, the mother bear gathered her cub and melted back into the forest, leaving behind only massive paw prints in the mountain soil and the memory of wild grace that had turned the tide of battle. Colonel Morrison's voice cut through the sudden quiet, calling for his scattered men to regroup. But the heart had gone out of the cavalry assault. Too many horses had been spooked beyond recovery. Too many soldiers had been demoralized by their encounter with nature's fury. What had been planned as a swift, overwhelming strike had become a confused melee that favored the defenders who knew every rock and tree in the valley. "Fall back to the ridge," Morrison shouted, his military pride warring with tactical necessity. "Establish a perimeter and await reinforcements." As the cavalry retreated to lick their wounds and reassess their situation, Thomas found himself standing beside Chief Motto in what had become an impromptu command post behind a cluster of boulders. The Apache leader's face was grim, but not defeated. This was a man who understood that winning a single skirmish was far different from winning a war. "They'll be back," the chief said quietly, watching the blue uniformed figures withdrawing up the mountainside. "Morrison won't accept this humiliation easily. He'll send for more men, bigger guns, whatever it takes to complete his mission." Thomas nodded, understanding the reality of their situation. They'd want a reprieve, not a victory. The railroad interests that wanted this land cleared wouldn't be deterred by one failed assault, and the government had resources the Apache couldn't hope to match in a prolonged conflict. "Maybe," Thomas said thoughtfully, "it's time for a different kind of strategy." 3 hours later, under a flag of truce that both sides honored warily, Thomas walked alone into the cavalry camp. Morrison stood waiting for him beside a field table where maps and dispatches were spread in careful order, the colonel's face a mask of barely controlled fury. "Come to surrender, Avery?" Morrison asked coldly. "Ready to remember your duty to civilized society?" "I've come to discuss terms," Thomas replied calmly. He pulled a folded document from his jacket, not military orders this time, but a letter written in his own hand and witnessed by Chief Matu. "Terms that might save lives on both sides and accomplish what you're really here to do." Morrison's eyes narrowed as he read the proposal Thomas had spent the afternoon drafting with Apache leaders. It was elegant in its simplicity. The tribe would voluntarily relocate to a designated area in the high mountains, well away from the planned railroad route. In exchange, they would retain legal ownership of their new lands, receive government compensation for their displacement, and maintain their autonomy in internal affairs. You think I have authority to negotiate treaties? Morrison scoffed, but Thomas could see interest flickering in the colonel's eyes. I think you have the authority to recommend policies that serve everyone's interests, Thomas replied. You get the valley cleared for railroad development without the cost and controversy of a prolonged military campaign. The Apache get legal protection for their new home and compensation for their losses. And the government avoids the bad publicity that comes from massacring peaceful families. It took 2 more days of careful negotiation, with Thomas serving as intermediary between the two sides. Messages flew back and forth to territorial headquarters and Washington, while Apache families remained packed and ready to flee deeper into the mountains if diplomacy failed. But in the end, pragmatism prevailed over pride. The railroad companies wanted land, not war. The government wanted expansion, not expensive military campaigns. And the Apache wanted survival with dignity, something Thomas's proposal offered when all other options led to destruction. On the morning when the Apache prepared to leave their ancestral valley, Thomas stood beside Kaya at the edge of the village that had been her home for 15 years. In her hands, she held a small stone carved with intricate symbols, his new name, given to him by the tribal council in recognition of his transformation from enemy to protector. Ishkane, she said, pronouncing the Apache words carefully. It means boy becoming man, but also one who chooses to grow. The elders thought it appropriate for someone who learned to see with new eyes. Thomas accepted the namestone with hands that no longer trembled with uncertainty. The symbols carved into its surface would remind him always of the choice he'd made in that mountain clearing, when a young woman's compassion had cracked open something long frozen in his heart. What will you do now? Kaya asked as the last of the tribal possessions were loaded onto travois for the journey to their new home. Thomas looked around at the peaceful valley one final time, then at the Apache families preparing to leave everything familiar behind. I'll do what I should have done years ago, he said. I'll use my skills to protect instead of destroy, to build bridges instead of walls. 6 months later, Thomas Avery, now known to his Apache friends as Ishkane, had established himself as a mediator and translator, helping other tribes navigate the complex negotiations required for survival in a changing world. His reputation was different now, built on successful treaties rather than successful hunts, on lives saved rather than lives taken, and sometimes on quiet evenings in the high country where the Apache had made their new home. Visitors would report seeing a large grizzly bear and her nearly grown cub fishing in the mountain streams, living proof that some families survive even the harshest changes when they're protected by love and determination. The white feather Kaya had given him still rode in Thomas's hatband, a reminder that even in the darkest times there was always a choice between destruction and mercy. And for the first time in his adult life, Thomas Avery was proud of the choice he'd made.